Hey, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I'm bringing you the first half of my conversation with Chelsea Howe, who at the time was creative director of EA Mobile. We spoke on February 11th, 2015. If you'd like to read a full transcript of our conversation, you can check the link below in the description, and also below you'll see a link to my Patreon, where your support helps me continue this work. Thanks.
Sure. My name is Chelsea Howe. I'm a creative director at EA Mobile in Austin, Texas. But I have basically done consulting and indie game development, game jam organization, judging, and game jams for my entire career. So I kind of have a foot in both worlds, and I really like it that way. It gives me two incredibly different perspectives at all times, which is great.
And so to start with, you actually had a question for me,
Yep.
which I love.
Yep.
Right out of the gate. I don't trust this guy. So what was your question?
I wanted to know how you define indies.
Okay, that's hard. How would you define indies? So I think like traditionally the analog I would make is thinking of indie rock. So in the early 90s, like groups of creative people who were meant to be, or became anyway, like an alternative to the majority of what was out there in their chosen discipline or medium. So what I would consider indie, although I think that's increasingly becoming a very nebulous term in games, is the equivalent of that, i.e., I'm such a smarty pants, i.e., people who are doing things that are different from what you would consider, or what we used to consider, quote unquote, hardcore games or games for hardcore gamers. Now, that said, because I know you probably can already eviscerate what I just said,
This isn't about eviscerating, it's a conversation.
No, thank you. That said, I think there's also this odd friction in games going on where there's a temptation to be very binary about viewing things in games. And so I think my definition rules out people like, I guess to a certain extent, stuff like Super Meat Boy, because they really weren't doing something alternative to what was out there, but they sure were independent. But on the other hand, they did go through a giant publisher. So I don't really know what indie is. And so this interview is over. That's the thing though, right? Like as time has gone on, it's gotten increasingly more difficult to define it to the extent that I think it's pretty much a meaningless term. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, first, I think that if we can answer all of the questions that we ask, then we're asking terrible questions. So I love asking questions that don't have good answers or clear answers.
I tried my best.
I think indie's like super, super interesting to me because I kind of see it along like a whole bunch of different axes. So you have things like Super Meat Boy and things like Journey, where with Super Meat Boy you have like the scale of team kind of is very indie, quote unquote, like a small team. Then you have Journey where it was like, again, a huge publisher, but the priorities were very different. Sorry, I'm going to start over again and tell you my dog came over with his rope and I was like, oh, he's so cute. He's so cute. No focus, but he's so cute. All right, he's gone now. So, so I can see it along a bunch of different axes. You have kind of like the theme and the content, and that's kind of what you were saying. Like there were people doing things that were very different. So like Journey, I would say, is like thematically and content-wise very indie. So that's one axis. Then you have kind of the business axis. So you have the people who are like, I'm not going through a publisher. I'm going to self-publish. I'm going to kickstart. I'm going to, not have a steady income for 12 months and hope that it's all worth it. And there are just tons of examples of those people who I think consider themselves indie. And then there's kind of this third, more nebulous one that's more about priorities. And so you think about most games are put out into the market for to make money and to have some kind of financial return. But then you have this whole other group of indies who aren't in it for the money, who are in it for like wild experimentation, for self-expression. And I think that differentiator in terms of the priorities when you go and make a game, like Journey was intended to make money, Super Meat Boy was intended to make money. If you look at what was Anna's latest one that I loved? I think Gay Cats in the Weird Woods. In the Gay Woods. I don't know. Some combination of gay, weird, and cats in woods. And
I'll insert a bracket, and it looks like you had great recall there. Don't worry.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that game. Yeah. I do know the one you're talking about, though. Yes. I
loved that game. It was so refreshing. I'm one of the co-founders and co-organizers for the Queerness in Games conference, and one of the things that I do is run the arcade version of that. And so we were getting all of these submissions that had really beautiful but incredibly heavy content. And then I got to that submission, and I was like blissed out for about half an hour. It was wonderful. But I think that's another type of indie as well, like the indie that it's just, my priority is not to make money. My priority is dog.
It's okay. Wait, your priority is what?
My priority is just self-expression, is experimentation, exploration. It's not money. And so money is a secondary or non-priority, I think, is another way to define indie.
Yeah, and I think the problem that I don't think I really need to convince you of with like a lot of the perceived sameness in games is that the reason that if that is true, like the indie space is being increasingly looked to for experimentation because the middle tier has sort of hollowed out and completely gone away, and they're not really, nipping at the heels of AAA. It sort of creates this landscape where there's just not a lot of experimentation going on. I think that's where you see some of the grumbling. Mm-hmm. But is that fair? This is already so super heady, and I love it. But is that fair to lump on just one section of games and say, like, you're responsible for doing all the innovation? Do it.
No, not at all. I think that's...
Yeah, I don't think so either.
Right? Because, like, that's everyone. Like...
Yeah, but don't you think that's kind of the attitude that we're seeing?
I think that's a little bit the attitude from the outside, but I think everyone who works at a big AAA company wishes they were doing more innovation and is like constantly fighting back against that tide of normalization that comes from like metrics-driven design and big budgets, and therefore like risk-averse business decisions, and just the overall lack of understanding about how games work that makes producers and executives afraid to greenlight anything they haven't seen before because they don't understand, hey, this has similar systems, this targets similar player motivations and player needs, even though it looks different. It's okay.
How are they fighting back, you think? Or and I'm not saying they're not. I mean, like I mentioned, like I've talked to AAA folks in this, and I talked to them about like, well, what is it the audience for games just doesn't understand about the way that they're made? What does the press not understand? So this is actually interesting. Like, how do you perceive that they're pushing back against that stuff?
I think so. I'll tell you some of my personal fights because this is a fight that I am constantly up against.
Okay.
A lot of the companies that I've worked at, the directive is usually, hey, X game is making gazillion dollars. How do we make gazillion dollars? Let's start with X game and add a differentiator. Like, I've heard that at least as many companies as I have fingers.
How many fingers do you have? Well, who's telling you this? Like, what roles in companies?
Usually the major stakeholders. So the people who have the money, who have the budget, who are basically the green light group that you're up against. So you go up, you want to green light something, you want to get a concept approved. The concept has to meet certain metrics, right? And I mean metrics in a softer way than like, estimated DARPU or whatever. Daily average revenue per user. I was
going to ask. Yep. Or I was going to Google it later and be like, okay.
Yeah. but things like, what are your comps? How are you making your estimates? Because you really can't get something greenlight without a estimate on how much money it's going to make. And the games that have the clearer comparison have much more robust estimates for how much money they're going to make. Whereas if you're doing something completely different, and your executive is suddenly drilling down like, oh, you think you're going to make Y dollars, how'd you get to that estimate? And then if you're like, well, there's really nothing like it, so I took this and this and that, all of a sudden all of that executive's confidence in your estimate is gone. And that lack of confidence in the estimate translates into lack of confidence in your proposal. And that's how innovative proposals get pushed aside in favor of, hey, this is Clash of Clans with, I don't know, a better crafting tree or a bigger skill tree, whatever. Clash of Clans with zombies. Like, that's incredibly easy to sell to an executive because they can look and see how much money Clash of Clans made, and they can look and see, how many installs Clash of Clans got, and they can say, okay, to get that many installs, we'll have to use this marketing budget. And they can come up with the whole profit and loss statement really, really easily, which makes them feel much more comfortable and much more safe and much more willing to give you the budget to actually go and make that game.
I was going to say, I sensed some of your enthusiasm wane as you were saying some of that, which I guess would be like so I'd be happy to transition into the list of things you said you'd like to see go away, because you mentioned at least one or two of them. But are we saying, just so that like we can at least lay this out for someone who is happening upon this page and is just hearing about all this for the first time, are we both more or less saying it's pretty irrelevant to be defining these different categories of the industry at this point?
I think that it's not very useful. As a tool to have a discussion, it winds up almost always getting into a discussion about terminology and semantics, which means that the words themselves aren't very...
Well, to be fair, you started there.
But I started there because there is that lack of clarity.
And I appreciate it, and I can tell you, too, this is something I've been thinking very heavily about. Unfortunately, these are the terms we have to communicate with each other, but like I said, that's something like, when this goes up, I really want to just brush aside, because I would totally agree with you. So this is something I wanted to ask, because saying that, you did say in your email that like some of the things you mentioned you'd like to see go away has to do more with casual mobile than indie. Mm-hmm. Can you just clarify on that?
That differentiator.
Yeah, like how are you differentiating? Since we are getting into semantics, like I'd love to just hear that from you.
Well, I was using the kind of standard definition of indie, and I think the only real big people who would consider themselves both like casual free-to-play and indie is probably Spry Fox. I don't really know of anyone else who's like, yeah, we're casual free-to-play, and we're also indie. So I feel weird talking about free-to-play in the context of being indie.
Why?
Because I think that so many indie folks are kind of anti-establishment, and I think free-to-play very much comes off as establishment. It comes off as the money-making,
They come off as anti-establishment, and yet they are all trying desperately to sell 1 million copies.
Yeah.
We just had a knowing laugh, but say someone reading this doesn't understand why we just laughed. Why is that funny?
It's funny because that's like the paradox of existing under capitalism, like true indie, and there are some people who are trying to do this. Like I know Mole Industries is... How do you say that? I've never actually said that out loud. I've only ever read it.
How do you spell it?
MLLE Industries.
Isn't it Molly?
Is it?
I don't know. The great thing is that this will just be written. Great. So again, you'll look super smart. I'd just be like, yeah, it's totally how you say that. But yeah, I know who you're talking about.
It's like, so it's funny because they're trying to break free of systems, and they're still trapped in this much bigger, all-encompassing system. that's why it's funny.
Yeah. Okay. And so I think you understand why I'm asking you to spell that out. Well, no, but also just because the whole spirit of this thing is communication, and so if we're having a laugh, as they would say in England, if we're having a laugh at them, like without really spelling out like how they're sort of trapped in a paradox, as you said, then like they're not really learning that from here. And it's also just possible they just haven't thought of it that way, and it's also arguable that like. I don't know how old you are, but I did realize in a conversation with a friend a few weekends ago that like a lot of the people you see talking about this stuff on Twitter basically are just kids themselves. Mm-hmm. So I don't think this has occurred to them yet.
Yeah.
But you said, so in terms of just, that's fine, because I just want to categorize people who make games as people who make games, because we don't really quantify like having more fun from one type of game than from another type of game. So you sent actually over a list of things you'd like to see recede from games in general, and you put energy in quotes, zombies/pirates, and aggression.
Like basically, all the tropey. Huh.
So, which of these annoys you most?
Which of these? Well, right now my big kick is energy. I think the one that is actually most meaningful to talk about is aggression as like our fundamental game content. Like it's really hard to find a game that doesn't have aggression as one of the fundamental things that you're partaking in. A few notable exceptions, mostly from again that game company, but like even some like Super Meat Boy, aggression, Samurai Gun, aggression. Like some of the like greats that we like idolize in indie are still about guns and war and fighting and killing, and it's really interesting how hard it is. Like Pokemon, aggression. Like it's really hard to fully grok just how deeply that's embedded in games and how much we need to get away from that. And then think about aggression that's not physical aggression. Like think about dating sims that wind up being about, still conquering in a way, still getting your own agency over someone else's agency. And then how, that kind of goes back to what games are, is that they're, in a lot of ways, they're little autonomy toys where you get to be in control. And what does that do to how we as people are within games, and what would a game look like that actually doesn't give you autonomy? And that's interesting because that's kind of why people hate free-to-play games, and they hate energy, because energy says, hey, you can't play with this toy anymore. Go and do something for a few minutes, and then you can come back and play again. And so I just think that that's like this hilarious logical loop that I've been kind of entertained with recently. If that makes any sense. Did you follow any of that?
Most of it, but I mean, I'm also here to hear about the things you're talking about. What are you so entertained about with that?
I'm entertained because it comes full circle. It's like we use aggression in games because aggression is one of the most base and primal forms of agency. We think that aggression in games, to the extent that it is in games, like monolithically, prolifically, you can edit that as well.
Sure. Oh, and I should say too, like I can show you a transcript of this before it goes up, and you can look over it, and I'll make sure I put the right word in your mouth, as it were.
I trust you to not make me sound too much like an idiot.
No,
any more than
This is mostly you talking, so I want to make sure you look good.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And that we think that the ubiquity of violence is problematic, but that probably stems from the fact that games are inherently, if you think of aggression just as the push or the dominance of your agency over something else, that's essentially all games are. And if we are uncomfortable with how much violence there is and how much aggression there is, and with the overall just state of us asserting ourselves over these systems, and everything that entails, and the kind of, entitlement that comes with that, and is that entitlement part of what created shit like what's been going on this past year, then what would a game look like that didn't have that kind of autonomy. And when you start thinking about that, you get into games that kind of have control over you or assert themselves over you in some way. And that's kind of exactly why free-to-play games have been getting flack. So there's this curious no-win situation where the games that take away your agency are bemoaned and hated upon, and the games that give you full agency and give you your fantasies are bemoaned and hated on. And to me, that just means that, you know, there's something for everyone, and all of them are interesting pieces of our ecosystem, and we should just make sure that our ecosystem is net positive. But that's what I think is funny.
I mean, how long have video games been around now? I mean, this isn't a history test, but like...
I was going to say, I believe it was like 58 when the very first something happened, and then Space War was in the early 60s.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say it's probably something like 50, 60 years now. And I was trying to think, like, because there was the market crash, and at first, like, as I was hearing you talk about that, like, I was thinking, like, well, games came back and they were targeted to be for children, and I think, like, that's sort of the stereotype thing. Mm-hmm. We heard people complain about video games in the 90s, just like, video games are too violent. But even before the crash, like, you know, Atari and all those things, like, the things you're saying were still true. Like, even when games were intended to be for adults. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think that the age of the audience has to do with what's problematic about aggression being the consistent fallback.
But it's just interesting that, like, even though they wiped the slate clean, mm-hmm. you know, like in the 80s, like, why wasn't that rethought at all?
Because I think that the people who were making games didn't really change. I think that the pool decreased, but I don't think that the people making them changed. I think that the people making them, like, if you talk to anyone who's, you know, got more than a decade in this industry, they'll tell you that, you know, at the time, you couldn't get into the industry unless you knew someone. And the nature of networks is such that the people you're going to know are going to be similar to you. And so you wind up, by and large, I'm making a generalization, but by and large, you wind up with incredibly homogenous groups of people making games. And that was what they'd done and what they knew, and it had failed, but it was still just, if that's the inherent part of your psyche that you want to realize in a game, like, that's not really going to change. Like, all the research shows that the things that you're intrinsically motivated by, your player profile, your player personality, I guess, doesn't change as you grow up. So it would make sense that if it's the same people making games, that we'd make the same kinds of games.